Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I'm just sitting here drinking my morning coffee, getting ready to start my day. Gonna cook my breakfast, do some squatting in a minute, and while we're on the topic of protein, because that's come up, people are always asking, hey, what are you gonna eat for breakfast today? Today's gonna be oven-baked chicken breast, beans, rice, and broccoli. I'm gonna do the beans, rice, and broccoli in my rice cooker. So there we go. We got examples of animal protein and plant protein, all in the same meal. Which kind of brings us to the topic, because this comes up, like yesterday I made a video about a semi-famous vegan doing some kooky stuff, and a bunch of vegans chime in and they start in with the protein thing. And I think this is a worthy topic to address, because there are people who, on both sides of the argument, who are not objective. They're not looking at all the pros and cons of all of this properly. They don't really assess it, and they have their own bias. You have vegans on one side who claim you can get all the protein you need to be an ideal athlete for optimal body composition, easily eating nothing but vegan foods, plant proteins. Then you have people all the way on the other side in the bodybuilding and bro world who say that plant proteins are completely useless and you only need to count the animal source proteins towards your goals towards protein intake for building muscle and everything. All right, both groups are wrong. Let's just get that out of the way up front. Both groups are wrong. We'll get to fat loss and we'll get to cancer and all that in a minute. But first we need to discuss the muscle building. As far as building muscle goes, the vegans are technically right, in that you don't need as much protein as you think you do to build optimal amounts of muscle mass. Here's the key word, if you are in a caloric surplus. If you are in a caloric surplus, we actually don't need anywhere near as much protein as we think we do to build maximum muscle mass. That means you take someone like me, who's a little over 100 kilos. We'll call me 100 kilos, even though I'm heavier than that. Which means you need about 1 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. That means for me 100 to 160 grams. Why do they have a range? Because protein absorption and quality varies. So if I eat an extremely high quality, easily absorb high bioavailable protein, I might only need 100 grams. And if I were to have a lot of plant-based protein that doesn't absorb as well, I might need 160 grams, right? You know, it's assuming a mixed diet. So that's why we have a range there. That's why we have a range instead of just a fixed number like they do over in the bodybuilding. 1 gram per pound of body weight. Okay, that's if you are consuming enough calories to be gaining muscle while maintaining or gaining body fat as well. When you start going to maintenance calories or you go into a deficit, the protein needs go up. This is where we get into a difference. Now the vegans are right there. You don't need as much, but then we come to that point of you will need more plant source protein to pull it off, because plant source proteins are not as bioavailable. That is a point they don't want to concede. Like they'll say something like, well, beans have 22 grams of protein with 100 grams of them, whereas in 100 grams of beef has 22 grams. It's the exact same amount of protein. And in fact, the beans might have a superior amino acid profile. Yeah, but you absorb them at half the rate. Only 50 to 60% of that protein from the beans are you going to fully absorb. You're going to defecate out the rest. Because of the high fiber content, you're going to have malabsorption issues with it. Fiber is a good thing, but it will block the absorption of, say, protein. And when plant proteins are caught into their plant matrix, you will absorb most of them somewhere between 50 and 70% of the protein. Whereas in a different source like beef, you're going to absorb probably 99 or more percent of it. You're going to get all the protein. And that's the difference here, guys. That's why it's not the same. It's not a one-for-one basis. Even when you go look at the amino acid profile, it might actually be slightly better on the beans in some meats. It actually is in some cases. And some plant proteins do have a higher quality amino acid profile, but they have a much, much, much lower bioavailability. So this is where we run into problems. So you still need, for ideal muscle growth when bulking, you're still going to need a fair amount of protein, and you're going to need more of it from plant sources. Now, should you be counting the plant sources? Of course. Why wouldn't they? If you can absorb 70% of the amino acids and it's a complete protein, and plants are complete proteins, most of them are not incomplete proteins. That's a myth. Some of them have some low amino acid profiles like rice, but beans are pretty good. A lot of vegetables are actually pretty high up there. Their profile's fine. It's just that you don't absorb as much of them. That's the problem. So again, then you start needing to increase your caloric intake even more, because you're losing calories there. You're losing calories from the protein and everything else. So The problem we get into, though, is that when we start getting to maintenance, we start getting to a caloric deficit, then your protein needs to go up, and this is where the vegans flat get it wrong. We've got data now showing that people who get very lean, in order to get ideal muscle retention, there's two things you need to remember as far as protein intake goes when you start losing body fat. You need more protein to hold on to your muscle mass, the lower your body fat percentage gets. In other words, when you're at 15 or 16% body fat, you will not need as much protein to preserve the muscle that you have as you do when you're at 10% and trying to lose a couple more pounds of muscle. You're going to start very quickly, if your diet isn't on point, when you start getting to 10% body fat or something like that and you keep trying to lose body fat, your diet is going to have to be on point for you to not start losing muscle almost at the same rate you lose fat. So you might get to a point very quickly when you get real lean to where if your diet's not on point, you're going to lose a pound of muscle for every pound of fat you lose. It's very easy for that to start happening. Extremely high protein intakes help, and a lot of it has to do with the IGF-1 involved. And this is particularly important for people who are trying to recomposition in any way. All right, that IGF-1 release is important from the higher protein intake. It is very, very important for preserving muscle tissue. It gives an anabolic effect. It's not even about the amount of protein you're using to build muscle anymore. It's about the IGF-1. And we do know that. We do, when we overfeed protein in people, they don't gain weight. In other words, when you start pumping tons of animal protein into a person, and there have been studies on this, people who are at maintenance, and you take people at maintenance, you add 500 calories of additional higher quality protein sources in, they don't actually gain body weight. But they do recomposition slightly faster. They gain a little bit more muscle and lose a little bit more fat than the control group. And it's probably largely due to the hormone release, the IGF-1, from all the extra protein being consumed. And animal source protein does more of that. Now we get into this point of vegans and other people will argue, based upon no scientific evidence, that, well, that IGF-1 leads to cancer. It's not been correlated, guys. Elevated IGF-1 levels from dietary composition, particularly from protein, has never been correlated with cancer in human beings. Those are rodent studies. And you guys need to understand, if we were to take rodent studies and apply them to humans, we could say that carbs get stored as fat in humans. They don't. They do in mice and rats. Surplus carbs easily store as body fat through de novo lipogenesis in mice and rats, so then we could argue against the high-carb vegans right there, oh, they'll make you fat. But in humans, that doesn't actually happen. Humans don't actually store under normal conditions carbohydrates as body fat. They really don't. Again, there's studies on how you can make it happen, but you actually have to work at it. Unless you have a severe metabolic syndrome already, and you're probably type 2 diabetic, it's not a real concern. Until you start getting to stuff like 1,000 or 1,500 calorie surpluses from extremely high carbs every single day, then you might see some of it start storing. But otherwise, relatively rare. Not something that happens under normal metabolic conditions in humans. So that's a perfect example. We don't use those studies. And in fact, in high protein consuming populations, animal protein consuming populations, we don't necessarily see a higher cancer rate from that. Now, too much saturated fat may contribute. And we need to remember, it's not dietary cholesterol. Vegans will throw out shit like, oh, dietary cholesterol. Well, no, that's not been linked to heart disease, but saturated fat has been in excess, and that includes plant source saturated fat. In other words, if you consume excessive amounts of peanut butter or coconut, that contributes to heart disease and everything else, and potentially cancer just as much as eating the really high-fat meats do. It does, and I'm sorry, the saturated fat is the issue. And even then, saturated fat is not some poison. It's perfectly healthy up to a certain intake. There's a threshold, like with anything else, where it starts to become a problem. But back at that point of the IGF-1, that's not been linked to cancer, but what it is linked to is fantastic muscle preservation, better muscle growth, because again, we go back to that point of the protein overfeeding. It's the IGF-1. It is the animal source proteins doing that. They are better for recomposition, period. Better for holding on to muscle tissue when you lose fat. Now, we get over to the point. This is where we get into a place where both are right. You'll see people who argue towards animal source proteins for fat loss. Well, you can overfeed tons of them, and the calories almost don't seem to count towards your intake in regards to fat loss. In other words, if you are in a calorie deficit but on extremely high protein intakes, you actually usually lose body fat at a faster rate than at a lower protein intake on the same calories. And there's the thermic effect to consider, and then there's the other hormonal response to consider. It's better for, again, body recomposition. It helps you hold on to muscle tissue easier, has a larger thermic effect. You get having a higher energy turnover on the same amount of food. So therefore, your calories in, calories out becomes far more favorable. And then you have the muscle preservation effect. But when it comes to the calories in, calories out, you'll also have people on the other side, yeah, but the plant proteins, you can eat tons of them, and the extra fiber has its own thermic effect in the body. It has its own metabolic effects. It has its own satiety. Because we come to that other point, the protein overfeeding causes better satiation. It's easier to eat less calories on really, really high protein diets, particularly even animal source. So for fat loss, that's a big win, and you have the muscle preservation effect. But you'll have people on the other side who will point out, yeah, but if you're eating 100 grams of protein from beans and other fibrous legumes and stuff every day, you're getting an enormous amount of fiber. You're also not absorbing all of the calories, and you have a high satiety. So that's also very positive for the energy in, energy out balance. And they're right, it is. The problem we get into, though, is that when it comes down to preserving muscle mass, ideally, you are not getting the extra protein. You're not getting the extra IGF-1 release, the things that we need to help hold on to muscle mass. And people need to remember that insulinogenic effect is enormously beneficial for preserving muscle mass, to the point to where we've studied white rice versus brown rice. Guess which one helps hold on to muscle tissue better and causes better nitrogen retention in a small caloric deficit? The white rice, because of the insulinogenic response. Insulin doesn't make you from foods, if you're healthy, high insulinogenic foods do not cause you to hold on to body fat easier. They help you to hold on to muscle mass easier. And again, if you guys understand basic biochemistry of what's going on in the body, you understand why that is. That the whole insulin obesity hypothesis has been dispelled. Experts do not believe this. Book writers believe this who write fad diets. Leading researchers don't believe this to be the case anymore. So we come over to this point of that isn't a good thing on the other end. For the energy in, energy out equation, actually they both have very valid points. They're both right. But when it comes to the actual preservation of muscle tissue and performance, the animal proteins are going to win. Now, the only downside might be, again, they're coming potentially, depending upon your sources, higher amounts of saturated fat, things like that. But that can be regulated by the choice of foods that you eat. And also, when you're in a caloric deficit, things like saturated fat don't seem to impact your cholesterol levels and things as much. It's not until you go to maintenance or a surplus that a lot of these things start to really create health problems. And that's just another factor to throw in also. So we come to this whole argument. Both sides have points, but the people who are claiming the plant source proteins are equal, that it's ideal, no. You can do it. I'm not saying you can't become an elite athlete or you can't get ideal body composition on mostly plant source or all plant source proteins. You can. It's just much, much more difficult. And becoming an elite athlete or getting an ideal body composition is hard enough as it is without putting extra crutches on yourself. Now, if that's your ethical beliefs, that's your choice to make. But understand that you are doing it for your own ethical and moral reasons, and it doesn't have anything to do with it being ideal, because it's not. And just because there are some athletes who are vegans who have made it doesn't mean that that was the ideal choice. It means that they had to put in even extra work with that, and a lot of them became elite athletes before they went vegan. Just throwing that out there. Just kind of a point that needs to be noted. They built their base eating animal source protein. But on the other hand, we also don't go over to this point of, even though animal source proteins are superior in a lot of ways, we don't jump up and say, oh, well, plant proteins are completely useless, because they're not. They still contribute to your amino acid profile. You can still build muscle out of them. They should be counted towards your total protein intake. And they tend to come with other benefits, such as extra fiber and other stuff, things that are beneficial for regulating body composition, your health, metabolism, everything else. So I would say to most people, in an ideal world for athletes or people seeking to maximize body composition, it's probably a good idea to have a good intake of both. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.